President.
The Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I rise today to join my colleagues in discussing the current direction of U.S. foreign policy, especially as it relates to the Middle East. The Obama administration's foreign policy in this regard has unfortunately totally unraveled. The President, to his credit, made the Middle East a priority and engaged the Arab world early on in his presidency. He attempted to forge a new beginning between the United States and the Muslim world, but his idealistic strategy simply has not worked. The Middle East over the last 3 years has been besieged by a resurgence of violence, instability, and terrorism. The administration has chosen to confront this challenge, which has major implications for U.S. national security, by leading from behind and relying on an ineffective diplomatic strategy that involves few concrete security measures. The shortcomings of this diplomatic strategy are painfully evident today in both Syria and Iraq. In September of last year, the administration praised the U.S.-Russian deal to disarm Syria of its chemical weapons. The deal was designed to rid Syria of chemical weapons and buy time for a diplomatic solution. Yet here we are today in a situation where the Syrians have missed countless deadlines, still have chemical weapons, and continue to use barrel bombs filled with chlorine, other chemicals, as well as ball bearings with impunity. In addition to the humanitarian disaster that has unfolded in Syria, allowing the status quo to continue has also given the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant and the al-Nusra Front the safe haven they needed to grow into the force that we face today. And make no mistake about it, terrorists are training inside of Syria today, planning to attack America and American interests. I've been shocked to hear news commentators and some in this body refer to recent events in the Middle East, including the rise of ISIL in Iraq, as intelligence failures. The intelligence community makes its fair share of mistakes, and I am the first to criticize them when they do. But these recent events, including the resurgence of ISIL, are not intelligence failures. They are policy and leadership failures. As we saw in Benghazi, the intelligence community provided ample strategic warning of the deteriorating security situation in Libya. Yet the administration did little to enhance security in Benghazi. Failing to protect a diplomatic facility despite repeated warnings is not an intelligence failure. It's a policy and a leadership failure on the part of the administration. With regard to Iraq, intelligence, including Director Clapper's testimony at a January 29, 2014 hearing, has been abundantly clear that Iraq was vulnerable to the threat from ISIL. I encourage any member to read the intelligence if they have questions regarding the intelligence community's assessment about security in Iraq and the rise of ISIL before the fall of Mosul. It was clear in 2011, as U.S. forces were withdrawing, that Iraq was vulnerable to a resurgence in extremist activity, and we have seen the violence escalate steadily in the last 3 years during this administration's failed policies. This collapse in security was again easily predicted, but we have stood by and watched as it has occurred. Again, this is a policy failure, not an intelligence failure. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of this administration's foreign policy is its inadequate counterterrorism strategy. I often hear administration officials touting al-Qaeda's demise or describing the organization as on the run. Yet nothing could be further from the truth, as my friend from South Carolina alluded to earlier. Well, before we began on the floor this morning, he said, yeah, al-Qaeda's on the run. They're running from one country to the next and taking over one country and the next. Violent extremism is on the rise in the Middle East, and the warning signs have been visible for years. These warning signs include the September 2012 attack in Benghazi, the rise of al-Qaeda-affiliated extremist groups like the al-Nusra Front in Syria, the resurgence of ISIL, and most recently, the fall of Mosul. And just yesterday, we see a terrorist flag raised over the largest refinery inside of Iraq. Despite these stark warning signs, the administration has only been willing to take very limited steps to curb this disturbing trend. Instead of focusing on making counterterrorism operations more effective, the administration has been focused on ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan while America's enemies grow stronger. This approach has been a huge gamble that continues to jeopardize America's security. The administration has sidelined many of the tools that we used successfully to counter al-Qaeda in the years immediately after 9/11, including the effective long-term detention and interrogation of enemy combatants. As a result, we know far less today about many of these terrorist organizations. Since the President ordered the closure of the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay in January 2009, our nation has been without a clear policy of detaining a suspected terrorist. Without such a policy, including one that identifies a facility for holding terrorists that are captured outside of Afghanistan, the intelligence community's ability to conduct ongoing intelligence operations has been severely limited. I recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for handling terrorists, but our detention policies must foster intelligence collection before any prosecution begins. Al-Qaeda, its affiliates, and other terrorist groups are determined to attack the United States. We constantly face new plots and operatives looking for ways to murder Americans, like the foiled May 12 AQAP plot to put another IED on a U.S.-bound aircraft. Thankfully, this plot and others didn't materialize, but we're not going to always be that fortunate. We know that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, today represents one of the biggest threats to the U.S. homeland and personnel serving overseas. They are continually plotting against our interest and seeking new recruits, especially among our own citizens as well as former Guantanamo detainees. Explosive experts like Ibrahim al-Asiri continue to roam free, posing a tremendous threat to the safety and security of U.S. citizens. The proposed closure of Guantanamo Bay presents significant risks for the United States and Yemeni efforts to counter AQAP inside Yemen. A substantial portion of the detainees remaining at Guantanamo Bay are Yemeni citizens. Transferring these individuals to a country plagued by prison breaks, assassinations, and open warfare at this point could prove very catastrophic. These detainees would likely join several other former Gitmo detainees who have returned to the fight in Yemen, further destabilizing the country and worsening an already tenuous security situation. The most recent example of a totally failed and dangerous policy on the part of this administration is the exchange of 5 Guantanamo detainees for Sergeant Bergdahl. We're all glad Sergeant Bergdahl is back. We should have done everything we could to get him back, and thank goodness he is now with his family. But the deal, the exchange of 5 individuals from Guantanamo Bay who wake up every morning now thinking of ways that they can kill and harm Americans was not the right thing to do. There were other ways to handle it, and yet this administration almost callously, without notifying Congress, and by the way, that was clearly intentional, the failure to notify Congress of what they planned to do when they signed a memorandum on May the 12th and didn't release these individuals for another 2.5 weeks, gives you a pretty clear indication that this administration did not want to come to Congress and say that we're going to exchange these 5 Guantanamo prisoners. And the reason they didn't is because they knew that there would be objections from both sides of the aisle to doing such a dangerous thing and setting such a terrible precedent. So whether it's in Iraq, Afghanistan, or other parts of the Middle East, Americans have fought and died in the war against al-Qaeda. Our nation is weary of war, but threatening elements still remain. And those 5 individuals that I just alluded to are clearly threats to the United States. I have asked the President to declassify the personnel files on those 5 individuals. Tell the American people what we know about them, Mr. President, and then look the American people in the eye and say, this was a good deal. I know they're going to return to the fight and they're going to seek to kill and harm Americans, but this was a good deal. Well, that's for the American people to decide ultimately. And I urge President Obama, my congressional colleagues, as well as the American people, not to abandon the gains that we've made in the fight against terrorism since 9/11, but let's remain steady and let's continue to fight the good fight. With that, I'll yield to my friend from North Carolina.